Okay, so there is another presenter that I wanted to hint, but now you know the name. He's coming from Romania. He's a Java champion. He is the founder of the Bucharest software craftsmanship community. He is one really deeply passionate developer about clean code, clean architecture, unit testing, and many other stuff. So I would gladly introduce to you Victor Rentea.
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
It's perfect.
Yeah, good. So let's get started because we have a lot of stuff to cover. Great. So the screen, is it visible?
Yep.
Yeah. First of all, I'm super glad being with you today. Honestly, that's the first time I attend the conference until this outbreak. So yeah, really interested how this will turn out. Integration testing with Spring, that's the topic today. Now, compared to what Sven presented you, probably I would aim for, let's say, a more introductory content, meaning that I will show you the basics. Okay, I'll show you the basics of how to write tests with Spring that cover more of your application as a bulk, as a whole, and not just testing very thin slices of it using mocks or other faking around. So let's start with a question, really. If you have a test that will hit and use files or database and queues and external web services, if you ever call such a thing or use such a thing from a test, if that test fails, will this be a bug? Well, you've probably all seen cases in which, this is not a bug, it was just because of them, right? It's their fault. So what happens if you write lots of tests relying on such external services is that eventually you will get to this feeling that tests fail occasionally. And the team will start thinking that this is a normal case. The team will just increase their tolerance for failed unit tests. And this is something that you don't want at any cost. The trick here is that this is not actually a unit test. This is an integration test if you talk to external systems. So the question is, the problem is that in any project out there, I don't want any kind of tolerance for failed tests. What will happen if you get into this habit of thinking that the tests fail every now and then is that suddenly, eventually, you won't care anymore about fixing those tests. Now, I don't want that. I want your team to be committed to have the tests green at all times. The best solution to this problem I've ever seen was from a team in Belgium that had literally this thing going on connected to a Jenkins machine. Every time the Jenkins was read, the tests were failing, this thing turned on without any sound, but just going like that. You can't even think with this in your sight, right? So all the team was committed to fixing those tests as soon as possible, right? This is the feeling that I want to have. In this scenario, I will basically, in most applications, I would recommend splitting your automatic tests into two pieces. One of them could be named unit tests, but I prefer to name them green zone, which basically contains the tests which never fail, which should never be failed, which only cover your own code. In comparison, there will be also some other integration tests which cover more of the code, maybe even talking to external systems. This is a lot more deeper than just testing some methods and some functionality in the green zone. It goes through many layers. It's way slower because it starts up a container, maybe some external resources, and also fragile because, as I said, if this fails, you won't trust that it's a bug. You will have this feeling going on that, oh my God, it should be their fault, right? Now, in the green zone, if a test fails in the green zone, it's surely a bug. Now, these tests in the green zone are super fast, and the thing is that some of them can be slower, however, in case you start an in-memory database or boot up Spring, as we will do today. Now, the overlapping is okay to happen, but the focus of today's webinar talk is the aim of moving as much code as possible into the green zone. What I mean here is that you don't want tests which would have spurious failures for unknown reasons. You want to cover as much code as possible using tests that only cover your code without any external resources involved. Now, this is the point. Now, again, I would like to insist that you should spend hours, days, weeks, no matter how much it takes to bring those tests under Jenkins. If Jenkins doesn't run some tests, then those tests don't exist, really. Now, that being said, let's jump to code because we have a lot of things to cover. All the code that you see now that I will push on Git, it's on this location, and this is actually the agenda today. Let's say this is what I will try to do today with you. We will read it as a recap at the end after we go through this content. Let's see how much we are able to cover in 45 minutes. Okay. So we are facing a simple Spring application with some things going on here. We don't really know for now much of that, but we want to cover a specific class with tests. The class is called feed processor, and I will just do this. Okay. This feed processor class uses a file repository to access files on the disk. Technically speaking, it calls two methods, get file names and open file, which returns an input stream back to the caller. This file repo has a typical implementation that says it will just intermediate the interaction with the file system. Now, the existence of this class itself is a point to consider. We took care to isolate any interaction with the file system, and we decoupled. We put it out in a dedicated class, file repository. The API was such in a way chosen that it offers basically full access to the files, meaning that it gives you the file names and input stream. I mean, it can't ask for more than that, right? Now we want to test just inspect the code. What does this do? It checks out all the file names in the certain folder, and now the folder, by default in the property file, now it points to an URL, a path which exists on the Unix machine, but I'm on Windows, as you can see. So I can't really test this directly because that folder doesn't exist in my environment. Not only that, it may be the case that on Jenkins or on wherever you run this test, it may be the case that you either don't have space on the file system, maybe the change mod isn't correctly configured, you don't have rights on the folder, maybe, who knows? Because of this, who knows, I want to cut out of my tests the interaction with the files, with the file repository. Now, how can I do that with Spring? So we will directly start with the idea that I will start Spring, and with Spring started up, I would like to test this class, right? By, however, decoupling and putting here something different than the bare implementation, which can't ever work, or I don't want to be running in my unit tests. That's the goal, really. Let's see if we can make it do it. We can make it happen. So first of all, again, reading the code. I'm taking the file names, then I'm iterating those, and I open each file on its library with resources, and then I count the lines of that, and the count of lines I sum up to a total, which I return at the end as a return. So what I need to test, for example, I would like to check what happens if I have a file in that folder with one line inside. How would I do that? Right. The typical, the brute force way would be to create a folder somewhere, to put a file in there and blah, blah, blah. But again, I don't want to be touching the file system, right? I don't want to be integrating with the file system. So I will decouple the file repository. How can I do that? Well, the first idea that you might have, even without Spring, without any other, would be to make this, to extract an interface out of that. Make this put an interface in front of this class, right? Push the interface wherever the former class was being used, like I just did now. So now the dependency of feed processor goes to the interface and not the concrete class. And then, guess what? Re-implement the same interface again for testing purposes. Let's try to do that. First of all, I will create here, let's say, file repo for tests. Okay. And then this one, I will need to implement e-file repo. Good. Now, when I implement this interface, of course, I need to provide all the missing methods. And now, what I want to achieve is to implement the same method without touching the file system. One simple way of doing that is to rely on a private, let's make it final directly, map, which goes from a string file name to another string, which is the content of that file. So practically speaking, I'm replacing the folder with a map. Now, this will be the data, let's say, equals new hashmark, thank you, Codota. Data.this I will implement using keyset, of course. And to open a file, what I need to do is just stream, basically, create from the data get file name, create from this string an input stream. Now, this can be done using input stream control space twice to suggest static imports from our beloved Apache Common EO Commons. There you go. Here, this opens up a stream based on the bytes of this string. Thank you. That's it. Now, what I need to do further is to create a getter for this data. Otherwise, I won't be able to change anything here. Or even better than creating an opaque getter, why not be more friendly to my test and see something like add file with a string file name and a string content. Nice. This will be a lot better for tests, more expressive. Data.put of file name and content. Thank you. Now, in my test here, what I need to do next is to have such an instance available for me, this dummy instance. So for Spring to know about that, of course, I need to make it component. And here, I need to inject file repo for test, dummy repo. Or better said, repo for test. This is better. Okay, the private, and then repo for test. Inside, I would like to add a file which is named 1.txt with one single line, one line. Perfect. Now, if I want now to run this test, something interesting will happen, because now there are two implementations of the same interface in the Spring application, and Spring will complain about that, telling you that you can't possibly. Otherwise, it's a different thing. Wait. Let me just comment this account. Okay, we'll just skip that. This is for. Okay, never mind this one. I will come back to this in a second. I just want to do this in a second. jdbg.h2.mem. You'll see how many things we'll cover today. So there are things which are out of order now, hitting me. Let's see now again. So my concern was that now in my application, in my Spring Boot application, I have two implementations of this interface. These two. Spring, when it starts up, wouldn't know which one to select. And hopefully this time will show me the correct exception. Yes, there is no such bean. Oops, clock. What are you doing? Facade. What are you doing? Wait. Facade. It's just, yeah. Again, out of order stuff. Don't mind that. Here, this, and again, run again. Let's see. This is the cherry on the cake. If we reach to mock time, if we move fast enough, I'll show you how to fake time. Let's see if this fits in this time. Now, coming back. The third exception should be the correct one. It says that actual one feed processor, I got a 0 back. Now, this is interesting because this time Spring does something which wasn't. I mean, this is a recent addition to Spring, meaning that if you reference an interface, but the field name is identical to one of the implementations, then it will take that implementation by default. Now, to fix this is something that honestly I don't like in Spring, because the name of the bean was previously file repo with a small f, and the file name here happened to be identical to the default bean name. This is why Spring identified which thing to inject in this reference. Now, when I don't have this occasional, this random match, what will happen when I run is that Spring will fail to start, saying that, okay, you want an iFile repo, but I found 2 of them. Which one do you want to use? And this causes me problems. How can I fix this? There are multiple ways. One of them is to mark this dummy with some profiles. We will get to that. But the simplest possible way to work around this is to realize that the file repo for test is only used for tests. So why is it in the first place in the Circle main Java? Let's move it down in the test part. As you move it down, what will happen is that when Spring starts up, okay, let's see. First of all, this can't possibly cause any more conflicts when you really run the application from scratch in real life. But now what happens is that the problem is still here because we are in tests, and in tests we see both of the implementations. We see, where are you, R1? We see both this and this, and this causes a conflict, a confusion for Spring. Now, how can we fix this? It's very easy. By using the primary annotation, we'll tell Spring that whenever he wants to choose between this and any other implementation, then this must win the fight, which gets us to the first, I hope, running scenario. Let's see what it tells me. So we have this implementation created from scratch specifically for tests, and this is green, great, but it is just one test. Let's play some more. Where are you? Feed processor test. Yes, let's make some more tests. What will happen now if I have one with 2 lines? Okay, let's say 2 line. I would expect to get back. Notice the horrible names of the tests here. Also notice the use of assert J here. And guess what? I will make a third test, which will have both the 1 file and the 2, and I'll expect 3. And I'll run all of them. Let's see what happens now. So practically speaking, this only file contains 2 lines. This is the case when I have one file with 1 line and another one with 2 lines. So 1 plus 2 equals 3. So this is what I expect to work. But guess what? This fails. Expecting 3 to be equal to 2. What the heck happens? And if you want to debug it, you run it independently, this one. Let's see what happens now. Because this is what you do when the test is failing. You click on it and you run it just that. You run it in isolation, just that test. But if you want to debug it, guess what? It's green. The point is, you notice, what do you feel now? What are you feeling now? If this would happen in real life cases, I bet that you will be cursing at this moment, because it's a test that if you want to fix and to debug, you can't, because when you run it in isolation, it passes. If you run it together with its brothers, it fails. Brilliant. This is always due to inter-test dependencies. The problem is that to figure out what really happens, you need to look at the log, and you need to count the banners that you see. How many times did Spring start it up? Once. What does that mean? Is that even though you have 3 tests, Spring starts up just once. Why? Because Spring testing framework by default wants to reuse the Spring, because this test, if you note, took from 54 to 21. This is a huge amount of time. This is 25 seconds, 26 seconds took this test to run, which is super, very, very much. The trick is that it's so much because it's booted up Spring. So Spring testing framework by default tries to reuse Spring instances. But the problem is that now, because you have this as a singleton in Spring, and you change the value of this singleton, this causes this test to fail. How can you do? How can you fix this? Well, one simple solution is to have another method, public void reset, which will just reset data.clear. And you should remember to call this function before each, right? This is one way to do it. We'll fix this, but it's dirty. If you put the line in all of these, on all 3, it's better yet put here in the before. Every time before each test, do this. This will fix the problem, but you need to remember to clear it, right? Which is a bit strange, it's a bit awkward, and can cause problems. Another way, more brutal way to fix that is to destroy the entire Spring context after each test. What does this mean? Is that I want to kill. Let me just commit this one before a reset of dirty singletons. Okay. Now the next idea is to destroy this. And instead of all of that, go here and say dirties context, declaring that each method dirties the context, and the context should be recreated before each test method. Throwing out Spring and recreating it. This will take a lot more time, of course, but it's a, let's say, a safe way. It's a brutal but safe way to ensure that nothing remains in Spring shared between two tests. Again, brutal, because this will dramatically impact the runtime of your tests. But let's just prove that this passes, and note how much time it stays. Now, and you're just running, and again, recreating again. It takes quite a lot. 10 seconds and growing, right? Look, 12 seconds instead of what was before. Now, I will commit this and say dirt is context. Context kills Spring. Context, Spring contexts between tests. Okay. Now, next stage is, if you have this in place, you might want to have this for some tests, but for others, no. When this happens, what you can do, I mean, if you declare like that, anytime, I mean, any test that starts up Spring will take this as an implementation instead of the one which was in Circle main. If you want to selectively decide if you want to take it or not, the way to do it is like that, in mem repo. And this tells Spring that it should only take this class into consideration in case you start with the active profiles, this. This will only use this repository in case you are activating this profile like that in your tests. Selective dummy implement test dummy for test. Okay, you can switch it on and or off. In some tests, if you don't put this, and I will prove that in a second. Look, I will stop them because they will be green. If you don't put this dummy repository won't come into play. There is a third way of implementing this, which calls into play a different kind of beast, which is an internal class which defines the Spring configuration. Oh, even worse, unsatisfied dependency. Yeah, it can't even detect this bean. It can't auto-wire this in test because there is no such class defined. Okay, good. So this is selectively, but there is even more selective, which is just for this particular class. It goes like this: test context configuration public static class, which is called something like my own config, okay, which allows you to define a bean. You know the bean annotation, public void and file repo for test. Oops, void. Okay, whatever. And if you do that, then the class that you have in the left-hand side doesn't even need to be a Spring managed bean anymore. Nothing. You see, it's just a plain class that, in case you want to summon, you will put this trick inside. So basically, all of these annotations in the test class are processed by this runner. This is the entry point in this trick. In JUnit 5, you don't need this runner. It's automatically detected. Let's see what happens. Reason. Because what? No such bean if file repo expected but found 2. Perfect. What I forgot to do is to put primary here. There you go. So embedded test configuration is merged over the configuration which is detected automatically by this runner. So this runner will scan up the packages here, searching for the first package in which it finds a Spring Boot application. And it will use that Spring Boot application to wire all the beans. Now, with this test configuration, you can override or you can supplement, you can add more things to the configuration. But again, not very useful, not often used. Test one test class only, custom configuration. Spring. Now, of course, no one stops you for putting this in a superclass of this test, so that all who inherit from that test, from that class, all the test classes that inherit from that class would have this configuration created additionally. But again, I must say this is not so frequently used. A way more frequent approach is the following. A way more frequent way of faking an implementation of a class is, and I will kill this, And with this time, with no dummy implementation, notice that there is no Spring annotation on this class anymore. So Spring won't see it at all. So I don't want to do that. But instead of that, look what I will do. We just saw the bean annotation here, right? We just saw I will just leave the third one because it's the most complex, and heck this. Or no, let me leave the first one. Yeah, that's it. Now, simplifying things, I want to do the same thing, but with a different tool. With the bean annotation you just saw, the mock annotation, most of you already know it's Mockito. But how about mockbean? Mockbean combines the two words, meaning that it starts up the Spring context, but anytime, but it replaces in this context the e-file repo bean with a mock repo, which is Mockito bean that created like we would do with mock method, right? The same way like that. Spring does it for you. So this is a bridge between the world of Spring and the world of Mockito. Good. Now, and this runner knows about it and interprets it accordingly when starts up this test class. What happens is that you can now teach when Mockito, when mock repository dot mock repository dot get file names, then return a set with one single value. Few people know that this is called a singleton. It's an awful name. It's a singleton in the collections class. Who the heck knew that? One.txt. I found out this after 10 years of Java, honestly. This creates an immutable a set with one single value. Then you need to also to teach the second method, which is called openFile, to do something. To do exactly this, literally speaking. So when mock repo.get, openFile, what file? You know what file, one.txt. Then return this. But the trick is you don't need to get anything because you know what you want to say, which is one line. There you go. This is it. Basically, you teach the mock that is added to the Spring. I'm running the wrong class in a second to run this one. That's it. So what really happens, you can imagine, the entire Spring starts with all the beans wired together, okay? But just one of the beans, this one, instead of being the real bean, is fake, and a mock is added instead of it and injected everywhere where the former bean was overwritten, basically. And the test is green, which is quite sweet. So mock plus Spring, Mockito plus Spring equals love. Next one. This was simple. Let us get to the next one. This is all recorded, folks. So you can watch this and you can check the Git afterwards. So don't worry. Just go with the flow. I want to test this file repository in no, not this one. Close everything. In the repo package, repo. There you go. Repo search. There you go. Do you know this kind of queries which start with select blah blah from where one equals one? Why do we ever put this? Why are we in this habit? Because then we just keep adding clauses to filter further the records. Okay, this is GPQL. I'm sorry, but it starts with one equals one and then and. Cool. Let's test this in repo. Product repo search test. The first idea is to persist the product. Let me put this next to the repository, to the search. Okay, there you go. So to test this repository, to test this dynamic search, what I need to do is to first, this is the most trivial test you can ever imagine. It just runs the query after persisting a product in the database, one single product. But before moving further, I need to come back and show, typically, in a normal application, this would be the case. It would be a Oracle something, or who knows, other driver, and some JDBC URL. If you want to start such a connection from your test, guess what will happen? It will crash in pain because there is no, maybe you don't even have the driver in the test scope, but the point is, you may not be able to connect to the real thing. That's why you might want to fake the database, not fake, but make it in memory. For this to work, look what you have to do. let's suppose this will be the case. Now, you would like to connect to an in-memory H2 created specifically for running the tests. For this to happen, one way to do it is the following. It's not okay to go to the Siriku main resources and change this. This goes to deployment. You can't change that. So what's the recommended way is to define an additional file, but look where I am, Siriku test resources, a new file, which is called application, let's name it dbmem. You aren't used to seeing application properties, but with other things coming after the name. And I want to explain what is that. Spring has this interesting thing going on, which I lost the test, 1 second. Has this interesting thing going on, which says that if you have this profile active, then Spring will automatically look for files named application dash profile name and add them overriding the properties which were already there from application properties in Siriku main. So technically speaking, you are selectively overriding this connection and choosing an H2 database in memory, completely in memory. Let's name it, this is typically the case. Good. Now, if you run the test, what will happen is that you will be using an in-memory data store, and H2 started up right when the application starts up. There are other things to consider, but which I won't go much into detail, but one of which, however, is important, the fact that I am creating the schema when the application starts up with this flag. Pay attention not to deploy with create in production, because you will wipe out the production data, as I did here. So the point here is that the schema is created each time. Right? This is a common scenario in case you are using GPA, and in case you aren't using heavily PLSQL. I mean, you aren't depending on a specific database implementation. If you are sticking to the standard, to the ISO, then you can switch to H2 at any time. Good. Moving further, what would you do? Let's see. What will happen in case you will write this test twice? Again, you aren't sure. You want to test it again. What will happen? If you run it, you will expect to pass, right? I mean, it's the same test. Why wouldn't it pass? Guess what? By default, if you run it like that, Spring, after each test, will commit this into the database. And the second time you run it, you will find 2 records in the database. 1, 2. Interesting. The same thing will happen if you want to run this in isolation, it will pass, just like before. You know about dirty context. I won't tell you about that because it's brutal. So now I'll show you a different idea. But first, let's investigate. Let's see why does this happen? To know more about what happens with your database, what I will do now, I'm doing in all my applications. I'm putting here an intermediary driver, and I'm sticking inside the URL just after the JDBC the term P6 spy. Magic. It's a kind of magic. What happens now is that a special driver, which I have in class part named P6 spy, which is free, open source, intermediates any interaction with the database. Effectively, what starts to happen is that all the statements which are sent to the database are nicely logged in. But besides the statement, which I find most interesting, is that it also tells you when a transaction gets committed in the database. And you can see 2 commits, each inserting a new product. And this is causing you the problems. Cool. So know about this spy.properties. Read about P6 spy. It's a must-have in any project that you're using hybrid or whatever relational database out there inside. Good. Moving further. Where is the? Let me close the others first of all. Nope. Where are you? Here. There you go. Close others. Perfect. Now, a way to fix this, a very elegant way to fix this, is to mark each method or directly on the class as transactional. What this will make will cause to happen is that the Spring testing framework will start a new transaction per each test method, and after each test method, it will roll back that transaction. This is somewhat the de facto way of testing things with Spring when you interact with the database. There you go, rollback. So the scenario is this. it starts transaction, insert. Let's see really. Looking at just this test, what did just this test? It inserted the product, ran the search, and then rollback. Okay, so they are independent transactions which never get committed in the database. Cool. Now, however, if for some reason somewhere evil will still commit to the database, what you can do, what you should do, in my opinion, is to make sure that the database is empty when you start your test, which you can do in the following style. Because sometimes it's very, very hard to debug what the heck happened and figure out that your test failed because the initial state of the database was corrupted somehow. To assert that, so I would recommend to do this: assert that from assert j repo.count is equal to 0. The beginning of the test. Now, if the transaction wasn't here, the failure would be a lot more precise. We'll just say that before running any kind of test, the database is corrupted, contains data that shouldn't be there. Let me prove it. This is a mandatory thing in large applications where you aren't entirely sure who and when commits to the database. There you go. The failure is now in a different place. If you click here, it's in the where the heck? Double click. Well, it's actually not easy to find out. Yeah, initialize. Here, click. This failed, not the actual assertion, but this one, the before. So this is again very, very useful. Another thing you could do in case there is data which remains in the database is to simply say repo.remove all or delete all. Right? Clearing the database beforehand. But if you are using transactional, this is not necessary because transactional will make sure that nothing remains in the database. Cool. Now, some other times, you will want to have a real, let's, how to put it? Let's actually write a test. So you have a product and its name, it's something like tree. Okay, and you are searching by criteria, which criteria contains the name. Now, pay attention. Tree. Will this pass or not? I expect to find the element. Okay, matches by name. Okay, if you run the test now, it's not sufficient because I need to see what happens in case I search by something completely different, and I need to check that this doesn't return any element, right? Okay. The benefit of using this, just I'm shooting things on you. Please excuse me, but this has size 0 is better than asserting length with assert equals because if it fails, it will print out very nicely the elements which were in the list. It helps. It really helps that. You can see what was returned. It seems to work, but what if I change here and put R or R? Wouldn't be normal to find the results in this case? What I mean here is that should I use equal to test for name or should I use like operator? Let's suppose business wants to use like operator, but then this test should pass. So guess what? If you run it, I expect it to fail now. Okay, let's see if it failed. Yes, expected 1, but was 0. Okay. And I'm, okay, good. So this is where it failed by name. Here, in this case, it did not match it. Okay, so to fix that, I need to put like here and probably append some nice percentage signs in before and after. Okay, good. Now, moving again further, I would say that business wants also to have it uppercase. So then what would you do? Upper, like upper. And there you go, and this should now pass. So if you ever want to debug this query, you would probably like to inspect the contents of the data. I mean, how would you debug the query if it doesn't work? Let's suppose it doesn't. Imagine the test will fail now. What would you do? You would probably go to the test that failed, take the select and be very willing to run it somewhere on a database. But there is no database because the database is just destroyed. It's in memory. So what can you do? is to connect to a real database. But in my case, the real database is still an H2 to have it accessible easy from IntelliJ. And I will say I want to create an H2 with user essa, and let's name it, ooh, what ugly URL you have. There you go. This should be the URL. Come on, where are you? Here. There you go. Plus data source H2. H2 essa, and then paste. And I think I'm pretty fine. H2. Now this is a standalone application a standalone database. The trick is that I can start it like that here. Let's see if it works. It's already started. Sorry, I started it. I will restart it for sure. So this test database really exists somewhere. It's just in memory for me. Actually, it's not really in memory. Now it crashed both places. Versioning. There is a problem here. 196. It's correct. Then what the heck is wrong? Interesting. I think I'll skip this part. I'll skip this part because time is running away also. You need to use a specific version of H2 for this feature. Anyway, I will just skip that. So you can connect to a real database because it's easy to imagine, right? Instead of connecting here to this mem like that, you will create another file which will put the real URL to the database that you want to connect. Nothing fancy there. But more important for me is to see further about the facade. Okay, so that would be the testing of a repository. Now let's see what happens if you want to test some facade. Now, I know the time is pretty much over, but 5 more minutes, if you can bear with me. I want to put directly into play the WireMock. Okay, so we have this product facade. Because WireMock is one of the things that you should consider using, really. Let's suppose you have this product facade. Okay, this product facade. One second, I want to fix something because it will crash otherwise. Okay. Yep, this is it. Good. Now, you have this class that you want to test. This really simple method. You will again inject the facade. You will inject the repository. You will inject things here, and you will want to call it. Let's call it product facade dot get product of a product ID. Now, how do you know what product exists in the database? Well, you will need to persist first in the product repository. Save a product. Now, this product needs to be created beforehand here equals new product, and after persistence, it will have the ID set in its field. Good. Then what you'll do, you will say product service get product. Cool. Let's already run it to see what happens. It's missing a semicolon. Great. Test. Save, and then get product. And feature not, no, this is the wrong chat. Okay. So I'm running product facade test. It's still building for some reason. What do I want to achieve here? Well, again, this facade will have a reference to the service. It will call the service. And then here in the service, it happens that it does a call to an external system. Because the time is running out, I will just want to prove that I get this exception in case the external service returns a false. Okay, so if this returns a false, then the exception gets thrown. So my test directly will want to expect that the illegal state exception happens. But before putting this check, let's see what it does now. Look what happens. It tries to call the REST endpoint depending on env intra 999. What the heck is this? Well, it happens that this isSafe method further calls some REST service out there. But the problem is that you are in tests. And in tests, you may not want to call that service. What would you do? You all know already how to decouple this client using MockBean, like I've showed. But I want to show you something new today. in this case. Let's suppose that I don't want to mock it, but I want instead to also cover the behavior of this function. To do that, I will create I will want to start and stop a WireMock service next to me, which is basically a dummy service running in parallel next to my tests. To do that, I will use a rule in JUnit, which allows me to start WireMock rule, WireMock equals new. This rule stuff, what it does really, it allows its WireMock framework to start and stop the service before and after each test method. And here it asks for a port. Let's say 9988, who knows, something completely wild. And then this port I would like to use here. Now, how can I override this property here with this URL? Well, I'll show you. It's called, even in Spring Boot test, you can say properties equals and say this property equal, and now comes the fun part. Well, the original one was HTTP this. In my case, what I want to override it with is localhost 9988. What will happen now? By this thing, I just overrode the URL here. Must be public, okay, public. Okay, I just overrode this value here, and what happens is that this will actually call the endpoint. The trick is that the endpoint will call the WireMock service which has started next to me. Now, I would like to point this call to go. You notice because this uses the external reference of the product to identify which URL it needs to call. As such, right now, WireMock reports that it did not match anything useful because I did not here. The request didn't have anything, although WireMock expected a request to unsafe ref. What's that? Control-Shift-F will find anything in the project, and it will get me to this file, which practically defines the expected responses configured for WireMock. So WireMock will answer if I do a get to this URL. For this URL to be the one which I call, I need from my test, where is the test? Here, my product to have an external URL equal to this. Now, note also, however, altogether the use of fluent setters. This setter returns me back the product. The setter is Lombok, but I took care of having Lombok config access or chain true, which makes my generated setters to have to return this by default, which is super useful and practical for tests at least. Cool. So let's see if I managed to point it to correctly. Okay. Now it tells me, it throws an exception, but this is exactly what I wanted to happen, really. If you remember, in the product facade, I wanted it to throw an exception here. Look, the product is not safe. This is exactly what I was expecting. So I can just say expected. There are other ways of testing the exception message that I got using another rule named expected exception in JUnit 4. But for a simple solution, this will work. What I was able to do, practically, I was able to run my entire code and actually do the HTTP request to some mock service started up there, which responded to the get to this URL using this JSON. And I also tested the mapping of this JSON to the correct objects. And I also tested it. So you can figure out this is faking the external service. Now, this practically kind of lets me out of time. Yes. I had more things to show you, but I will end up now and leave room for questions. Just to wrap it up from my side, what I do for a living today: trainings, Hibernate, Spring, functional programming with Java, design patterns, domain-driven design, clean code, unit testing, performance, stuff, good stuff. The thing is that if you liked it or you want to know more on a slower pace, of course, you should know that I started opening webinars on Teachables. And also, if you want for company, contact me, and you can follow me for free webinars like that I run monthly. Good. Now let me hear some questions because it's more important.
Okay, thank you, Victor. It was really an awesome presentation. I really, really enjoy every time your personal style of presenting. It's really funny, really nicely introduced. So yeah, great job for that.
Thank you.
So there is something that is really interesting for me, and I would like about the dirtiest context. There's something that I have been wondering. What would you say about for and against having it in each and every class that has this that is using Spring for the test? And what would you recommend? Is it a good idea or a bad idea, and why?
To what again? Can you repeat what to have in each class?
To use the dirtiest context annotation.
Oh, no, never.
On each and every class.
No. The reason, I mean, I will use the slides that I didn't show you to answer that. The reason, I mean, the only way where I will use a dirtiest context is to debug why it crashed. Basically, I run my suite, and in case some test goes red when I run it in the suite, but turns back green when I run it in isolation, then I put dirtiest context before to see if it's the cause of a Spring singleton somewhere remaining dirty. Just for probing the reason, right? If with dirtiest context before it turns green again, then it means it was the fault of Spring. So something remained dirty in Spring. What typically remain dirty in Spring are either singletons in Spring or some database which was corrupted or committed somehow, right? Someone committed somewhere something in the database. What the most often situation is that someone does a transaction requires new and commits something to the database with outside of the test transaction that I will roll back at the end. No, does transaction requires new, commit, and then at the end I roll back the test transaction. But who cares, because the data is in the database. I had dozens of lot of such cases. So don't use dirtiest context on a normal scenario, because it will make your tests way more slow.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, it looks like people are really recognizing you. So pretty famous guy, really nice. And there are a few questions actually that are really popping up one after the other. There's a question about how do we apply these principles to test repository REST resource? This is a question by Ravesh.
Well, first of all, it's in my opinion, it's a bit dubious to use repository REST resource in production system. I mean, it may be far-fetched what I'm saying, but if you do that, you are basically giving up implementing any kind of logic in your application. You are just exposing your persistence data right out of the wild. It's how to put it. Probably it's the case in nano services, not micro, nano, super thin services, which just, I mean, how to test it? What is to test? How to put it? If you just like repository REST resource. I don't think I have the necessary dependency here, but normally you would create an interface, okay? And then on that interface, put that annotation, and that's it. I mean, finished, nothing more. You don't have anything to test there, really. Well, what would you test? The query? If you want to test the query, then call it from a normal test, like I did in the repo test, like I showed you. I mean, call it manually, directly. It's nothing, I mean, I hope you don't want to test if the Spring framework does it correctly. I mean, anything that the thing that you really want to test are the queries that you wrote. I mean, trust the frameworks. Don't test the framework. The framework is pretty much well tested already. You don't need to test it yourself. That's not where the bugs are. I'm not sure if I answered the question fully, but regarding testing things which are generated 90% of that, I won't test it at the beginning. If you have time at the end, okay, maybe, but that's not where the risk is. I hope I covered. I don't know. Again, if there are questions left because there's little time, feel free to contact me. On Twitter, again, I'm also a big fan of it. So tweet me directly, quote me, or email, however you feel like. just ask me if afterward if there are. But any other question perhaps we can ask, we can answer.
Yeah, there are a few more that we can continue with. So one of them is raising the Spring context inside a test takes a lot of time, and you said the JUnit tests should run like 100 per second. If you also have Spring integration, it will take ages until all flows are started. What is your approach? Do you separate between JUnit tests into short and long tests? This is a question by Florin D.
Perfect question. This is the point of what I highlighted. Look, exactly here. This is what I wanted to say with separate projects. But in a separate project, I would put the tests which run slow, but I would consider also moving the slow tests from the green zone out in a separate project, or at least a separate, how to put it? I don't want it to be, I mean, when I run the test in the current project, I don't want to wait 2 minutes to finish, right? I want to have feedback in terms of seconds, right? So those slow tests, you can move it in a separate project, which you can depend on the other. You may run into another issue. Maven circuit tests are not exposed between two Maven artifacts, and you may need to write some little interesting things there. But as a driving idea, it's a good thing to separate slow tests from fast tests. But you can also do this in IntelliJ very easy using patterns. When you run the tests, let me try to demonstrate like this. Run as, where the heck are you? On the entire project. Run as. When you run the tests, you can adjust this, and you can say here, what test do you want to run? Pattern, for example, right? And you can impose some convention in your test and have those fast tests run only those, you see? Do you have time for another question, or?
Oh yeah, we can have some. Yeah, so you finish with this one, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. And then related to this one, there is another one. It's really a curious one. I don't expect that there is a definite answer, but I'm still going to ask it. How long a build in a project should we aim for? The person adds, before we sense that a lot of integration tests should be faster. This is from Alphonse.
The question is, what should we, can you explain, can you repeat again?
I think he wants to ask how long a build should be going for a certain project. What should be the aim of the build length?
As fast as hell. I mean, super fast. But again, I'm not so much concerned about the build time as the feedback loop time that I am using daily. I mean, if the build takes more than 10 minutes or 2 minutes or 5 minutes, what I want is to have super fast feedback on my changes. I want super fast feedback from my tests. This is indeed related to the previous question. And yes, I want to run continuously the tests, the fast test. The build can take longer. I mean, it's later in the stage. The question is about the tests, right? Probably, because
I think it combines the build time, I guess, in Jenkins combined with the integration tests, not only the build. I think this is what he meant.
Okay, then in Jenkins it should be at most several minutes, at most. Because the slow test, I would probably configure Jenkins to run overnight, right? But the fast tests, I will make them run at each commit. So after you commit, you should have the email in your inbox in 2 minutes if the build failed or not. This is the goal. The reality is that you can wait 10 or 15 minutes. That's the sad truth. How can we do next? Can I answer the question on the feed there, or because the time is up and I don't want to? There is someone after me, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to.
You can follow the feed and you can write them personally on the streaming URL on the website. So yeah.
Yep, I will do that right now. Good. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great opportunity. Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
It was really a pleasure, really professional and really nice delivered.
Thank you.